Montana Territory, January of 1887. The storm that struck the Bear Paw country that week would later be remembered as one of the worst the territory had ever seen, the kind that killed cattle standing up in open pasture and froze rivers solid to the mud beneath them. But to Naomi Hartley, walking a road she no longer recognized with her son's small hand locked in hers, it had no name yet. It was only wind, and snow driven sideways hard enough to sting through wool, and a temperature that seemed to drop with every step she took. The wagon axle had cracked 2 miles back, on a rut she hadn't seen until it was too late, and the horse had gone lame pulling it free of the ditch. She had left both behind with what blankets she could spare and carried what mattered most: a carpet bag with her father's instruments wrapped in oilcloth, a tin of matches, and Aaron, 6 years old, shivering under her shawl, though he would not say so out loud. She had been walking the better part of an hour when she saw the light. It sat low on the horizon, one square of yellow through the driving snow, and she did not know whose house it belonged to, or whether anyone inside would open the door to a stranger on a night like this one. She only knew that Aaron's lips had gone the color of ash, and that the barn beside the light stood closer than the house did, and that some decisions are not really decisions at all. She turned toward it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The barn doors were latched from the outside, which told her something about the man who owned them before she ever saw his face. She lifted the bar herself, fingers too numb to feel the wood, and pulled Aaron in out of the wind. The dark smelled of hay and horse and old leather, and after the open plain it felt almost like shelter enough. She was still working the door shut again when a lantern came swinging across the yard, and a man's voice, low and none too friendly, demanded to know who in creation was in his barn. She did not run. There was nowhere left to run to. She stepped into the lantern light with Aaron pressed against her hip and said the only thing left to say: "My wagon broke an axle on the road. My boy is cold clean through. I am not asking to come into your house, sir. I am only asking if we might sleep in your barn until the storm breaks." The man raised the lantern higher. He was tall, dark-bearded, somewhere past 30, wearing a coat still crusted white from whatever chore had called him out into the storm in the first place. He looked at her a long moment, then at the boy, then back at her, the way a man looks at a fence line he doesn't trust to hold. "Where's your husband?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Dead 2 years, Naomi said. "Timber accident, back in Michigan." She did not soften it and did not explain further. Explaining had never once made a stranger kinder, only more curious, and she had long since stopped paying that particular toll. He was quiet again. Somewhere behind him a horse shifted in its stall, and the wind found a gap in the boards and screamed through it. "There's a corner stall not in use," he said finally. "Hay enough to keep warm. Door to the house stays shut. I don't take in strangers past my own threshold, ma'am, and I'll thank you not to ask again." It was not kindness, not the way she had once understood the word, but it was shelter, and she had learned in 2 hard years that shelter without kindness was still shelter, and a body could survive a good deal on that alone. "Thank you," she said, and meant it plainly, without pride and without shame either. He set the lantern on a nail, told her his name was Ezra Colton, and left them there in the dark and the straw and the smell of horses, pulling the barn door shut behind him with the particular care of a man closing a door on something he did not want to think about again that night. Naomi had grown up the daughter of a liveryman in a small Michigan town, and if there was one thing her father had taught her before the fever took him, it was that most creatures, horses and people alike, could be read the same way. You watched the eyes first, then the hands, then whatever they did when they thought no one was measuring them. Ezra Colton's hands, she had noticed even in that brief lantern light, were scarred in the particular way of a man who worked his own stock rather than paying others to do it, and his eyes had gone soft for half a second when they landed on Aaron before he caught himself and hardened them again. She filed it away the way she filed most things now, without comment, and set about making a bed of hay for her son. She banked what warmth she could find, gave Aaron the last of the bread from her bag, and sat with her back against the stall boards while he slept against her side. She did not sleep herself for a long while. She thought, as she often did in the quiet hours, of Daniel, and of the farm they had meant to build together, and of the letter from her cousin in Larkspur that had promised work and a roof and had turned out, upon her arrival 3 weeks past, to be 6 months out of date. Her cousin had moved on to Oregon, without writing to say so. The boarding house in town had wanted payment in advance she did not have. She had spent what little remained of her coin on the wagon and the horse, and the hope of finding honest work somewhere along this road. And now the wagon sat broken in a ditch 2 miles back, and the horse was likely dead of the cold by morning. And she had nothing left but a carpet bag of her father's tools and a boy who trusted her to know what came next. She had known rejection before that storm, though not the kind that came from strangers with lanterns. She remembered standing on the boarding house porch 3 weeks earlier, Aaron half asleep against her shoulder after 2 hard days on the stage, while Mrs. Agnes Pruitt looked her up and down through the screen door and asked, before anything else, whether she had payment in hand. Naomi had explained about the wagon money already spent and the work she meant to find once she was settled, and Mrs. Pruitt had looked past her at the boy and said, not unkindly exactly, only plainly, that she did not run a charity house and that a widow with a child underfoot was more trouble than the room was worth to anyone. She had said it loud enough that 2 women crossing the street had slowed to listen, and Naomi had thanked her for her time and walked on with as much dignity as a body could carry down a public street with her whole future rearranged in the space of a single sentence. She had not cried that day either. She had learned, by then, that crying changed nothing a stranger's door was likely to do. She did know, in fact, though she would not have called it knowing so much as habit. You did the next necessary thing. You did not weep where the child could see it. You found the barn instead of the door, because a barn asked less of a stranger's mercy. And mercy, she had learned, was a coin most people spent carefully and only on their own terms. Morning came gray and still, the storm not broken but only resting, the way such storms did in that country, before gathering themselves for a second and often worse assault. Ezra Colton came out to the barn before full light to feed his stock and found the widow already awake, the boy still sleeping, and the woman herself standing at the stall rail, watching his horses with an attention he had not expected from a stranded traveler. That mare's carrying low, Naomi said, before he had even set down the feed bucket. She nodded toward a big-bellied Morgan mare in the end stall, her flanks heaving slightly, her ears pinned back at nothing in particular. And she's restless. How far along is she? Ezra stopped. Delia's not due for another 3 weeks, he said, more sharply than he meant to. What do you know about it? My father kept a livery stable, Naomi said. I helped him foal more mares than I can count, some of them early, same as I'd guess this one might be, if that storm coming back tonight puts enough strain on her. She said it without apology, the way she said most things, and went back to watching the mare's flank. Ezra did not answer. He finished the feeding in silence, refusing to look at her again, and when he left he barred the barn door from the outside once more, though he left the corner stall unlatched from within, which Naomi noticed and understood for exactly what it was. Not warmth, not yet, but the first small crack in a fence he had built, for reasons that were none of her business. The reasons were not hard to guess. Once she had spent a full day in his barn listening to the ranch hand, an old man named Whitcomb-Spear, who came by at midday with more bread than 2 people could eat, and considerably more conversation than his employer allowed himself. Whit had worked the Colton spread 11 years, since before there was a Mrs. Colton, and he told it plain, the way old men who have buried more than their share of grief tend to when a stranger gives them the chance. Hannah Colton had died 2 winters back, bearing a child who did not live to draw breath, in a storm not unlike this one, with the nearest doctor snowed in 20 miles off, and Ezra riding half the night through a blizzard to fetch him anyway, arriving back too late by hours. He don't let much past that gate since, Whit said, nodding toward the ranch house. Can't fault him for it. Man closes a door hard enough times. Eventually, it just stays closed. Naomi said nothing to that, only nodded, and understood a good deal more about the man who had told her not to ask twice. She turned it over for a long while after Whit had gone back to his chores. She thought of her own 2 years since Daniel's accident, the particular arithmetic of grief that never quite balanced, no matter how many times a body ran the numbers, and found she understood Ezra Colton a good deal better for knowing it. Grief did not make a man cruel, she had come to believe. It only made him careful in ways that could look like cruelty to someone standing on the wrong side of the fence he had built. She did not resent him for the barred door. She only hoped, quietly and without much confidence either way, that the door might open a little further before the week was out, if only for Aaron's sake, who had not slept a full night warm since Michigan. By late afternoon, the wind had begun again in earnest, and by dusk it had grown into something with teeth. Ezra came to check the stock twice more, wordless both times, and Naomi kept to her corner with Aaron, who had woken hungry and frightened and increasingly restless in the close dark. She sang to him, lo, an old hymn her mother had sung, and did not know that Ezra Colton stood outside the stall door longer than his chores required, listening to a voice he had not heard the like of in 2 years, before he made himself walk away. It was near midnight when the mare went down. Naomi heard it before she understood it, a low groaning sound and then the heavy thud of the mare's body dropping into the straw, and she was on her feet and at the stall rail before she had fully woken. Delia lay on her side, sweating despite the cold, her sides heaving in the unmistakable rhythm of labor come too soon and too hard. Naomi had seen this exact trouble a dozen times in her father's stable. She did not need long to know it. "Aaron, stay right here and don't move," she said, and was already climbing the rail into the stall. Ezra arrived within minutes, roused by some instinct or the sound of the mare's distress carrying to the house, and found the widow on her knees in the straw, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hand pressed flat against the mare's straining side. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. "Get out of there," Ezra said, more fear in his voice than command, though he would not have admitted to either. "That's a green mare in trouble, not a horse, you know." "She's not green, she's frightened, and the foal's turned wrong," Naomi said, not looking up. "Feel here." She took his hand, before he could think to refuse it, and pressed it to the mare's flank where a small hard shape pressed back against them both in the wrong direction entirely. "That's a hind leg where a head ought to be. She can't birth it like this, not on her own, and not with the two of you standing over her arguing about it." Ezra went very still. He had lost one mare to a breech birth 3 years back, before Hannah, before any of it, and had never forgotten the particular helplessness of watching an animal die in front of him for want of knowledge he did not have. "Can you turn it?" he said. It was not really a question either, not this time. It was closer to a plea, though his voice did not know how to sound like one. "I can try," Naomi said. "I'll need your hand steady and your lantern close, and I'll need you to trust me for the next half hour, whether you're inclined to or not." He did not answer with words. He knelt in the straw beside her, held the lantern where she told him to hold it, and did exactly what she asked for the next 35 minutes without a single argument, while outside the wind tore at the barn boards, and Aaron watched wide-eyed from the rail, too frightened to cry and too fascinated to look away. The barn had gone hot with the work of it, despite the cold night outside, lantern light throwing huge trembling shadows up the rafters, and more than once Naomi heard her father's voice from 30 years back in that old Michigan stable, steady and low. "Walk her through it before you touch her. Don't fight what the body's already trying to do." She found herself repeating the words to Ezra now, nearly the same words, passed hand to hand through a stall door half a continent removed from where they had started. Naomi worked with the calm, unhurried competence of a woman who had done difficult things before and had learned that panic never once turned a foal in the birth canal. She talked low to the mare the whole while, the same tone she used on Aaron in the dark, and reached in past her elbow to find the misplaced leg, and worked it, patient and firm, back into the position it needed to be. Twice the mare's contractions fought her nearly to a standstill. Twice she waited them out rather than force the issue, because her father had taught her that a body in that kind of trouble needed a partner, not a wrestling match. Ezra held the lantern and did not breathe. When the foal came at last, slick and trembling and very much alive, sliding into the straw in a rush that left Naomi soaked to the shoulder and laughing. Actually laughing, a sound Ezra had not heard from anyone in his barn in longer than he cared to measure. He sat back on his heels and looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has badly misjudged. "You did that," he said, "same as if you'd done it 100 times. "Closer to 200, Naomi said, wiping her arm on her skirt, entirely unbothered by the mess of it. "My father used to say a liveryman's daughter learns to deliver horses before she learns her letters." He wasn't far wrong. She looked over at Aaron, who had climbed halfway up the rail to see, his eyes enormous in the lantern light. "It's a colt," she told him. Come see, if you're quiet about it." The boy came, slow and careful, and knelt in the clean straw beside the new foal, and reached out one small hand to touch its wet, dark coat with the reverence of a child laying hands on something holy. "He's gonna be a good horse," Aaron whispered. "He will," Naomi agreed, "on account of the trouble he gave everybody the night he was born. The good ones always do." Ezra Colton, watching the boy's hand rest gentle on the foal's neck, and the mare lift her head to nose at her son, with the particular exhausted tenderness of a mother who has just fought hard for a life, found that whatever wall he had built 2 winters back had a crack running clean through the middle of it, wide enough now that he could not quite remember why he'd built it so high in the first place. He did not say much more that night. He fetched dry blankets from the house without being asked, more than the barn had seen in months, and a plate of cold beef and bread that he set down beside Naomi without comment. And when he finally latched the barn door for the night, he left it unbarred from the inside, a small thing, but the kind of small thing that meant a great deal more than its size. By morning the storm had blown itself out into a hard, bright cold. The sky scoured clean and merciless blue. The snow piled in drifts against the north side of every fence post on the place. Ezra came to the barn at first light to find Naomi already up, the foal steady on its legs and nursing, Aaron curled asleep in fresh hay, with the mare's dark head resting near enough to breathe on him. "You saved that mare and that foal both," Ezra said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which was not a thing he had done for anyone in longer than he could easily say. "I'd have lost them both if you hadn't been in my barn last night." "You'd have found a way," Naomi said, though she did not believe it, and neither, from the look of him, did he. "I wouldn't have," Ezra said plainly. "I want you to know that. Whatever else comes of this, I want you to know I understand what you did, and what it cost you to do it with your own boy watching, and nothing owed to me at all." He turned his hat over once in his hands, an old habit Whit could have told her about if she'd asked. "The house has a spare room, been shut up since Hannah passed, but it's dry and it's warm, and I'd be obliged if you and the boy would use it, for as long as you've got need of it. That's not charity, that's a debt, and I pay my debts." Naomi looked at him a long moment, the way she had learned to look at people, watching the eyes and then the hands. What she saw was a man who had spent 2 years keeping every door in his life bolted shut, offering her the one that mattered most, plainly and without asking anything back for it. "We'd be grateful," she said. "For a little while, until we're back on our feet." It did not stay a little while. 3 weeks passed, and then 5, and the spare room that had sat shut up and cold for 2 winters filled again with the ordinary sounds of a house being lived in. A boy's laughter down the hall, a woman's step in the kitchen before dawn. Naomi cooked, not because anyone asked her to, but because idle hands had never once suited her, and Ezra found himself coming in from the cold earlier each evening than the work strictly required, telling himself it was only for the warmth of the stove. Aaron followed Whit around the barnyard with a devotion that made the old man's chest ache pleasantly, and helped tend the colt, which Ezra let the boy name, and which Aaron called Storm, for reasons nobody in that house needed explained to them. One evening in late February, Ezra came in from the cold to find Naomi at the kitchen table with Aaron, a slate and a stub of chalk between them, the boy sounding out his letters slow and careful while his mother waited, patient, for each one to land. Ezra stood in the doorway a moment without either of them noticing, watching the lamplight fall across the two of them bent together over the slate, and thought, not for the first time that month, that a house could go a long while thinking itself merely quiet when it had in fact only been waiting. He hung his coat by the door instead of the hook nearer the porch, where he had kept it out of habit since Hannah passed, and pulled out the third chair at the table without being asked. But Larkspur was not the barn, and Larkspur had opinions. It was on a Saturday in early February, when the roads had cleared enough for the wagon, that Ezra drove Naomi and Aaron into town for supplies, and it was in front of Dunmore's general store, with a good portion of the town's Saturday trade gathered on the boardwalk, that the trouble finally came to a head. Silas Rourke, who ran the spread bordering Ezra's land to the east and had never in 11 years managed to be neighborly about it, stepped down off the boardwalk with the particular swagger of a man who believes he has found something worth making a scene over. "Colton," Rourke said, loud enough to carry to every ear on the street, "didn't know you'd taken in strays. This the woman I hear's been squatting out at your place since the January storm? The one folks are saying walked off with my bay gelding the same week she showed up, Near as anybody can figure? A hush went down the boardwalk the way it does in small towns when a fight is about to be handed out for free. Mrs. Agnes Pruitt, who ran the boarding house and had turned Naomi away at the door 3 weeks before that storm, without so much as a second look at the boy beside her, folded her arms with the satisfied expression of a woman who had suspected as much all along. I did wonder how a widow with no money got clear across the territory, Mrs. Pruitt said, to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. Vagrant's what I called her at the time. Don't see cause to change my opinion now. Half the county's been wondering the same, Rourke pressed, warming now to the size of his audience. A woman showing up out of a snowstorm with a boy and no husband and no papers to speak for her. And Colton just letting her set up housekeeping like it's the most natural thing in the world. Man doesn't even know her people, far as anybody can tell. Could be running from something a good deal worse than a dead husband, for all the rest of us know. A few heads along the boardwalk nodded slow. The particular nod of people who have decided a story sounds plausible mainly because it is entertaining. Naomi felt the old, familiar instinct rise in her, the one that said to lower her eyes and let the words pass over her the way water passes over stone, because arguing had never once bought her anything but more trouble in a town not her own. She kept her chin level instead, and her hands still at her sides, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing she could say that would matter half so much as what happened next. "Your gelding," Ezra said, stepping down off the wagon slow and deliberate, "came through the down section of my north fence the same night of that storm, same as 3 of my own steers did, and I found him standing in my corral 2 mornings later. Which wit here can testify to, on account of he's the one who haltered him and rode him back to your place himself before the week was out. You'd have known that, Rourke, if you'd bothered asking a straight question instead of building yourself a story you liked better." Rourke's face went a shade darker, but he held his ground. Story or not, a man's got a right to wonder what a woman like that is doing sleeping under a decent man's roof, with no ring on her hand, and no family within 1,000 miles to vouch for her. The street had gone entirely silent now, every eye on the little cluster in front of Dunmore's store, and Naomi understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has been the subject of a small town's judgment more than once in her life, that whatever was said in the next few seconds would decide how she and her son were spoken of in Larkspur for as long as they lived within its reach. Ezra Colton did not raise his voice. He never had, not once, not even in the barn with the mare going down, and his own fear rising in his throat. He simply stepped up beside Naomi, close enough that the whole street could see exactly where he meant to stand, and put his hand over hers where it rested at her side. "She's not sleeping under my roof out of charity, and she's not there because she's got nowhere better to be," Ezra said, plain and even, loud enough to reach the back of the boardwalk. "She's there because she pulled a breech foal out of my best mare with her own 2 hands, the same night she near froze to death, asking to sleep in my barn instead of my house, because she didn't think she had the right to ask for more than that. She's there because my boy's been happier this past month than he's been in 2 years, and because I intend to marry her come spring, if she'll have me, which is a good deal more than I've managed to say to any of you about my own business in longer than I care to remember." He looked around the boardwalk, unhurried, meeting eyes that had a sudden and urgent interest in the toes of their own boots. "She stays, and I'd take it kindly if this town found itself something better to talk about." Nobody answered him for a long moment. Mrs. Pruitt's arms unfolded slowly. Rourke opened his mouth, found nothing worth saying in it, and shut it again, and turned back toward his own wagon with the particular stiff dignity of a man retreating from ground he'd badly misjudged. It was old Whit, standing at the back of the little crowd with his hat already off, who broke the silence, calling out that he'd stand up as witness at the wedding himself if anybody cared to ask him, and a ripple of laughter went through the street that took the last of the tension with it. Naomi did not say anything either, not then. She had spent 2 years learning that her worth was not a thing she needed to defend out loud, and she was not about to start defending it now, not when it had just been defended for her, plainly and completely, in front of the whole of Larkspur. She only turned her hand under Ezra's until their fingers laced together, and let that answer stand for whatever words she might have offered instead. Word traveled fast after that, the way it does in small towns, though not in the direction Rourke had hoped. Mrs. Pruitt sent a jar of preserves out to the Colton place before the week was out, with a note that said only that she hoped the boy liked peaches. which was as near to an apology as the woman had ever managed for anyone. Dunmore began setting aside the good coffee for Naomi's order without being asked. Even Rourke, weeks later, sent a hand over with a length of good rope as payment, he said, for the trouble of returning his gelding, which everyone in Larkspur understood to mean a good deal more than the rope was worth. They were married in April, in the same little church that had held Hannah Colton's funeral 2 winters before, though nobody in that room spoke of the sorrow of it, only the rightness. Naomi wore blue, plain, and unadorned, and Aaron stood beside Ezra at the front of the church, solemn as a much older man, because Ezra had asked him properly, man to boy, whether he'd stand up with him, and Aaron had said yes with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what was being asked of him. Whit stood as witness, exactly as he'd promised on the boardwalk, and cried without shame through the whole of it, which surprised no one who knew him. That evening, with the wedding supper cleared and Aaron long since asleep with the Colt's lead rope still looped loosely in his small fist where he'd fallen asleep in the barn and been carried in, Naomi and Ezra sat together on the porch steps in the last of the April light, the mountains going purple in the distance, the mare Delia grazing quiet in the near pasture, with her Colt beside her. "I keep thinking about that night," Ezra said. "About the door I nearly didn't open." "You opened it," Naomi said. "That's the part that matters. Plenty of men wouldn't have. Not even that much. I told you not to ask twice," he said. "First thing I ever said to you, and it was a hard, ungenerous thing to say to a woman with a freezing child on her hip." Naomi considered this, and considered him, this careful, guarded man who had built a fence around his own grief, and torn it down one plank at a time, without ever quite meaning to. "You gave us the barn when you had every reason not to," she said. "Some men wouldn't have opened even that much of a door. I've knocked on plenty in my life that stayed shut regardless of how cold the night was." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the mare and the Colt in the last of the light. "I didn't ask for the house, Ezra. I only ever asked for the barn. Everything past that, you gave me on your own." He did not answer that in words. He put his arm around her instead, and they sat together on the porch until the mountains went fully dark and the first stars came out hard and bright over the Bearpaw Range. And somewhere in the near pasture the young horse called Storm, born in the worst of that January's fury and carried safely through it by a stranger's steady hands, settled down in the new spring grass beside his mother and slept. In the years that followed, Larkspur told the story of that night a dozen different ways, the details softening and growing with each telling the way stories do in small towns, until barely anyone recalled the particulars beyond the shape of it. A woman who had asked for nothing but a barn, and had been given, in the end, considerably more than that, because she had never once demanded it. Aaron grew up calling Ezra nothing grander than Pa, said plain and easy, the way a boy says a word that has simply always been true. And every January after, when the wind came down hard off the Bearpaw Range and the snow drove sideways across the yard, Ezra Colton left the barn door unbarred, a habit Naomi never once asked him to explain, and never needed to. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.